Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is Napoleon. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off discussing the French Revolution. And, we broke it down into two main parts. And ultimately, what happens at the end is to deal with the issue of the Directory. A coup is planned. And to oust the Directory, they bring in Napoleon. And so let's talk about Napoleon. Now, Napoleon was born of Italian descent from a prominent Corsican family on the French island of Corsica. He was an avid child of the Enlightenment and of revolution. Now, he was a military genius who specialized in artillery. Now, politically speaking, he associated himself with the Jacobins, and he would advance rapidly up the ranks of the military because of vacancies caused by the emigration of aristocratic officers. In other words, during the Revolution, many of those aristocratic officers were forced to flee or go into hiding or go into exile to avoid being killed or because of the politics going on during the Revolution. And it created a number of vacancies that Napoleon was able to take advantage of. Well, after helping to subdue the Directory, he will usher in and inspire a divided nation. And so during the Directory periods, he's brought in to solidify their power and to prevent, an uprising against them. Napoleon he will inspire the divided nation and usher into a period of a unified nation at the price of individual liberties. And what we break into now is from the Directory into what's known as the Consulate period. Now, the Consulate period runs from 1799 to 1804, as you can see. This is known as the Enlightened Reform era. And so officially, on December 25th, 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte takes power. And the Constitution gives him supreme power. He saw himself and was proclaimed first consul. Napoleon would actually behave, though, as an absolute ruler, more so than a revolutionary statesman. In fact, you may think of Napoleon as the last and most eminent of the enlightened despots. For all of his talk of revolution, he was a big child of the Enlightenment, and he is going to instead act much more like an absolutist ruler who embraced those Enlightenment ideals, i.e., enlightened despots. Now, again, this is the period of unification in what he does to reform the nation. The first big one is the Napoleonic Code. This is the codification of French law. He will bring legal unity. And this is perhaps the longest and most enduring legacy of Napoleon's reign. It includes a civil code, a criminal procedural code, a commercial code, and a penal code. Emphasized a strong protection of private property. No more estate system. There is no more legal classes, no more special privileges for the elites, but rather equality before the law. The abolition of serfdom. Women would receive inheritance rights. However, women will not get equal status with men. In other words, women and children are legally dependent upon the father or husband. Divorce actually becomes more difficult to obtain for women than it was during the Revolution. And women could not buy or sell property, begin a business without their consent of their husbands. And penalties for adultery was far more severe for women than for men. So while there is a codification law, which is good, rights for women actually begin to regress under Napoleon. Now, second big thing he did that was very popular was what he called careers open to talent. In other words, citizens theoretically were able to rise in government services purely based on their ability. Again, theoretically. Theoretically, he wanted a system based on merit. Do you have the ability and the scholarly aptitude and the knowledge to do it? Unfortunately, while that was the purported idea, ultimately wealth determines status, which of course benefits that huge middle class. The government would reward wealthy people who worked effectively, or so who effectively served the state with good pensions, properties, or titles. And workers were denied the right to form trade unions. And the sans culotte, that working class movement, had no impact on this new government. And so, law-wise, he does codify it. However, things are not perfect. Women will regress in their rights, and ultimately, well, theoretically, the careers open to talent is there. Ultimately, that is not really the case. Now, to fix the religious problem, remember we had that huge, call to supreme being issue that converted Notre Dame Cathedral into a place of enlightenment. Well, in the Concordat of 1801, Napoleon reaches an agreement with the Roman Catholic Church, granting the church status as the majority religion of France. Now, he does this for very political reasons. He makes peace with the church to help weaken the link to monarchists and those who sought a restoration of the Bourbon, dynasty. And religion would also help them accept any economic inequalities in France. So, does it to make peace? Yes. Does it to shore up his power more than anything else? And to prevent rebellion among the poorer classes, he would use it as a way they could cope by using religion. Now, what are the provisions of this? Well, the Pope would recognize the French government and accept the loss of church properties that were confiscated in the Revolution. But in return, the Catholic worship in public would be allowed, seminaries would be reopened, and there would be legal toleration for both Protestants and Catholics, Jews, and atheists. Again, this is why he's considered a enlightened despot. He does provide freedom of religion and religious toleration. Now, remember, one of the big issues, of course, was the idea of financial system, right? We talked about how important this was in other countries, how France lagged far behind, which was one of the causes of the revolution. Well, in 1800, they opened the Bank of France to serve the interests of both the state and the oligarchy, to balance the national budget, and to establish a sound currency and public credit. And what it did do was stimulate the economy. They provided food at low prices, they increased employment, and lowered taxes on farmers. So again, the bank helped solidify the financial system, economic system of France. The educational reforms, they would create basic education, because education was important for determining social standing. And however, there was a two-tiered system. There was one for the wealthy, and there's one for the poorer classes who would only spend 12 years at school, and after that, get a job. So it was not a full success here, educational reform, but it was a step in the right direction. But despite all these positive reforms, again, enlightened despot reforms, he would also create a police state. He kept an extensive spy system that kept thousands of citizens under continuous surveillance. He censored the press. He suppressed political opposition. Just for example, 2,500 political prisoners existed in 1814. He was ruthless, especially against any kind of guerrilla warfare in the West. And then we have to talk about the wars. Now, the Napoleonic Wars of the Consulate era. These are a series of wars that are usually short and very distinct. Only Britain would actually be continuously at war with France during this time. Again, they want to check on that balance of power. So we're going to go through kind of these wars, but keep in mind, the only nation ever constantly at war was England with France. The other great powers, including Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, they never unified together, all four of them, to fight France until he takes Italy in 1813. Up until that point, each one would just kind of fight individual battles against them. So again, those four nations being Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain. Well, beginning in, late 1798, 1799, we begin what's called the War of the Second Coalition. Now, Napoleon had his navy destroyed by England's Lord Horatio Nelson at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. And it left Napoleon and his army stranded in North Africa. It was then when his army stranded in North Africa, Napoleon is going to sneak back into France and help take the capital and install himself in power. Now, finally, his men were still in Egypt, by the way, 2 years later in 1801, and he would finally end the war with the Treaty of Lunéville. This ends the War of the Second Coalition. It results in Austria's loss of its Italian possessions. And once again, put Britain in isolation. But what's important here is what happens next. During this, what's called the peace interim in 1802, Napoleon is going to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Amiens, with England. And Britain agrees, hoping to stop being so isolated and increase its trade with the continent. Britain agrees to give Trinidad and the Caribbean islands back to France to give them a stronger foothold in the Caribbean. However, unfortunately for Britain, this didn't really result in much benefit for them. In fact, all they did was lose their possessions in the Caribbean. So truly, it was a treaty that was a victory for Napoleon. And ultimately, Britain technically violates the treaty by failing to evacuate the island of Malta, which will provoke a new war with Napoleon. In the midst of all this, of course, Napoleon's going to send a huge army to Haiti to subdue this peasant slave rebellion, the Haitian rebellion. And during this time, he also, in order to recoup losses and gear up for war in 1803, he's going to sell Louisiana to the United States in hopes for recreating an American empire. Because he realizes that he's not going to be able to recreate this American empire. And he hoped the Treaty of Amiens would restore the Caribbean islands to him. He hoped he could use that and parlay that into an American empire once again. Unfortunately, by 1803, he realizes that, this is not going to work. He sees wars coming with England. So rather than trying to hold on to what he can't keep, the American colonies, he sells Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson. Instead, redoubles his effort to take over Europe. And so with the sale of Louisiana Purchase, he now has the money to purchase guns, armaments, food, and mercenaries. And we enter into a new period of French history, known as the Empire period. So this basically the sale of Louisiana Purchase ends his ideals of an American empire, American colonies. Instead, in 1804, he transitions from the consulate period to the empire period and begins to wage war against the continent itself. He wants an empire. So on December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon crowns himself the quote-unquote hereditary emperor of France, unquote, within the Notre Dame Cathedral. And again, he believed that an empire was necessary for France to maintain and expand its influence. Now, he saw himself as a liberator who freed foreign peoples from absolute rulers who oppressed them, even though he himself was an absolute ruler who kind of oppressed his people. But he does this because he's a strong believer of the Enlightenment. He's an enlightened despot, right? And so in 1805, Napoleon begins an era of constant warfare. And by 1805, we begin what's called the War of the Third Coalition. Britain signs an alliance with Austria, and Napoleon's conquest of Italy convinces Russia and Austria that now Napoleon is, in fact, a threat to that continental balance of power. It goes back to that balance of power. And so at this point, you have Austria sign an alliance with Britain to fight against France. Now, on October 21st, 1805, we will have the Battle of Trafalgar, in which the French and Spanish fleets are destroyed once again by the British Navy under Lord Horatio Nelson off the Spanish coast. And basically what this does, though, is it does convince Napoleon that you're not going to be able to invade Britain. He's failed twice at it now, failed to win against Britain's navy, and instead he decides to refocus his effort on the continent itself. Now he focuses instead going toward Austria and Russia and moving eastward. Yes, eastward. And at the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805 in Moravia, Alexander I pulls Russian troops out of the battle, which give Napoleon another victory. Austria is forced to accept these large territorial losses in exchange for peace. So the War of the Third Coalition ends. Yes, Britain remains unscathed, but because Russia breaks down the coalition, Austria is forced to surrender and give up huge losses. It is in, sorry, there's your map of it. It is after the Battle of Austerlitz, this victory in the War of the Third Coalition, that Napoleon is going to commission the Arc de Triomphe in 1806, using a classical style harkening back to the Roman Empire, for when Caesars would build arches to signify important victories. Again, he's clearly emphasizing the conquest of an empire. Now, after this victory, Alexander I of Russia will seek peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Tilst, and on June of 1807, Prussia is going to lose half of its population and land ceded to France. You can see the new map. Russia is forced to accept Napoleon's reorganization of Western and Central Europe. In other words, things are looking bad. And this Treaty of Tilst represents the height of Napoleon's success. As you can see, Europe was at his feet. So what becomes of all this new land? Well, he begins to reorganize Germany. And after, again, getting most of this territory thanks to the Treaty of Tilst, after defeating soundly the two most powerful, influential German states, Prussia and Austria, Napoleon begins to reorganize Germany. First thing doing, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire. It is now officially dead. He consolidates the German states into a French-dominated confederation of the Rhine. He consolidates most of the nearly 300 individual political entities and names himself the protector of the new confederation. He actually sparks a wave of German nationalism that rises up to protest his rule. And you can actually look to Napoleon as kind of the catalyst for German unification later in the century. This is the height of Napoleon. Now comes the downfall. After the Treaty of Tilst, he decides that he wants to wage economic warfare on Britain. And basically this is, again, he's realized he can't necessarily just invade Great Britain. So he installs what's called the Continental System, and issues what's called the Berlin Decree. Napoleon seeks to starve Britain by closing ports on the continent to British commerce. In other words, he wants to basically isolate Britain by forbidding basically Britain from trading directly with the continent. And Napoleon, thanks to his victory, is able to coerce Russia, Prussia, neutral Denmark, and even Portugal and Spain to adhere to this boycott. Now, England in response will issue what's called the Order in Council, in which neutrals might enter continental ports only if they stop after Great Britain first. They try. And Britain does seek to strangle French trade and limit the number of imports to Britain. Thinking back to U.S. history, this is when we start having the issue of impressment of American soldiers, what's going to lead the War of 1812. Because beginning in 1806, Britain's in trouble. They're being isolated. They're being, starved out of the continental trade. And when U.S. ships, U.S. being a neutral nation, began to send ships to trade with Napoleon, the British began to intercept these ships. They began to confiscate these ships and ultimately kidnap the sailors. Again, this becomes one of the major catalysts for the War of 1812. It was all about shipping rights and impressment of sailors. Now, ultimately, what we do find is the continental system is a major failure. What it did do is cause major antagonism against Napoleon's rule in Europe, in large part because of the United States. Imports from America were too much in demand in Europe, and therefore trying to prevent US trade became a massive antagonization against most of Europe. Second, there was not widespread railroad use in Europe yet. And as a result, the continental system was impossible to maintain. You couldn't get supplies across the continent. They still relied heavily on ships, and the ports are closed. Eastern Europe is especially hit hard. Again, they're dependent fully on imports. They have no ports, and they rely on no railroads to get the trades to them. Now, in the meantime, things begin to change. Napoleon in 1810 marries Marie Louise, who's the 18-year-old daughter of a Russian emperor and the niece of Marie Antoinette. So by marriage, Napoleon is now the nephew of Louis XVI. And he begins, as a result, to show much more consideration to the French noblemen of the ancien regime, the old regime. And it's during this period we start seeing, thanks to the continental system, thanks to this, he starts to become much more an aristocrat, becoming the nephew now of Louis XVI. That he begins to have revolts. The first greater revolt is known as the Peninsular War in 1808. And it's a revolt against Napoleon's power in Spain. Napoleon tries to tighten his control over Spain by replacing the Spanish king with his brother Joseph, and the Spanish people waged a costly guerrilla war. Angered Spaniards constantly ambushed French troops, suffering more than 300,000 losses. Now, looking for a scapegoat in all this, because again, how dare Napoleon actually admit defeat? Again, he can't admit he loses. Looking for a scapegoat, he finds someone to blame. He blames Alexander I of Russia, who had initially supported the continental system of Britain, but Russia really didn't stop exporting grain to Great Britain. And so again, did Russia have really anything to do with Spain? No. But because he had broken, Russia's Tsar had broken the continental system, which is also failing for Napoleon, it was an easy scapegoat, and it gave the French people someone to target. Again, when you're a dictator, or when you're someone with a Napoleon megalomaniac complex, a god complex, you need someone to blame so people can put their fear against. Again, you separate, you divide, you create what's called an other. They're to blame, always a them. And in 1812, Napoleon decides to invade Russia. So in June 1812, his grand army of 600,000 men will go to Russia to invade Russia. Again, big mistake. Oh, by the way, fun fact, only 1/3 are actually his own French troops. The other 400,000 were actually foreign mercenaries and from other nations. So he reaches Moscow very effectively, kicks all types of Russian butt. But by the time he reached Moscow, Russians are forced to evacuate the city, and Tsar Alexander I is forced to surrender, or he is forced to leave, yes, but he refuses to surrender or negotiate. And rather than let the city be taken, Russia burns Moscow, using what's called a scorched earth tactic. And basically, he just burns everything. Now, this is incredibly destructive to your country, and they ever hopes that you ever get your land back, you have nothing left. But using scorched earth saves Russia and destroys Napoleon, because it burns all the food, all surrounding Moscow. They burned everything, the grains. They did it ostensibly for the food purposes, but also for military. I mean, they burn all the factories. You can't produce more weapons. Napoleon can't keep on fighting. He's far away from his supply chain, and now he has no food. And now it's turned to winter. So Napoleon is forced to retreat from Moscow after only 5 weeks during the brutal Russian winter. Eventually, Napoleon's armies literally froze to death. Only 30,000 men in Napoleon's army ever returned to their homelands. 400,000 were taken as casualties, starvation, and exposure. 400,000 died of casualties, of being, battle casualties, battle wounds, starvation, and exposure. Over 100,000 were taken prisoner. And again, only 30,000 ever returned to their homelands. Most got recommissioned elsewhere who did survive. Napoleon would race home as fast as his little legs could take him and raise another army because Austria and Prussia had now deserted Napoleon after the continental system failed. And now they had joined Russia and Great Britain. So Russian survives on the scorched earth attack and forces Napoleon to retreat, losing over 400,000 men to death, 100,000 to capture. Napoleon races back home to try to raise money and raise an army because now he has the War of the Fourth Coalition. The combined armies of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain. That's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.